Okay, ready to dive into some serious history.
Always. What are we digging into today?
Today, it's the history of economic warfare.
Ooh, that sounds intense.
Yeah, we're going deep with this book, Histoire mondiale de la guerre économique.
World History of Economic Warfare, for those of us who didn't spend years mastering French.
Exactly. And trust me, this is not some boring textbook stuff about trade agreements.
No, it sounds much more interesting than that.
Oh, it is. This book reveals how empires and nations, even tribes going way back, have been using economics as a weapon for ages.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it like that, how far back this goes. You might think of economic warfare as a modern invention, something we've just come up with recently.
Right.
But this book traces it all the way back to the Stone Age.
The Stone Age. Okay, now that is going way back. I mean, what could they possibly be fighting over back then? Were they arguing about who got the best cave paintings or something?
Think even more fundamental than that. We're talking about access to vital resources,
Okay.
lakes, rivers, prime hunting grounds, the best spots to gather nuts and berries.
Okay, so we are talking about food, even back then.
Exactly. Even in prehistoric times, those locations were highly sought after, and control over them often sparked, well, conflict, to put it mildly.
So basically, the struggle for the best real estate is as old as humanity itself.
Pretty much.
But I'm guessing things got even more, I don't know, heated once agriculture entered the picture, right?
Absolutely.
Uh,
With agriculture, you suddenly have this new concept, surplus.
Makes sense.
And with surplus comes, well, the desire to hoard it, to control it. This naturally led to even greater competition for the best land, the biggest harvests, and you guessed it, more conflict. The book even talks about how tribes would go to war not just for territory, but for control of those resources.
It's like that old saying, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, but with significantly higher stakes.
Right.
So we're seeing this connection between economic power and violence emerge very early on.
Precisely. And as we move into the ancient world, this economic violence becomes even more, well, sophisticated. The book gives this great example of the Phoenicians.
Okay.
Now, they were known for their trading prowess, but they also weren't afraid to play a little dirty to get ahead.
Oh, how so?
They were masters at using, believe it or not, religion as a tool to control their markets.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They would spread rumors about their competitors, about their supplies.
Like what?
Oh, suggesting that their goods were cursed, maybe, or that their suppliers were dealing with, shall we say, unsavory characters, things like that.
That's clever, if a bit sneaky. It kind of reminds me of how some companies today try to control the narrative about their brand,
Hmm.
even resorting to some pretty shady tactics to discredit their rivals.
Right.
It seems some things never change, huh?
I know, right? The tactics might change, but those underlying principles of economic warfare, they remain remarkably consistent throughout history.
That's a good point. So let's jump ahead a bit. What about the Middle Ages? It's easy to picture that period as all knights and castles, but I have a feeling there's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Oh, absolutely. The book actually paints this really fascinating picture of the era's complex relationship with trade.
Complex in what way?
Well, on the one hand, merchants back then, they were often viewed with suspicion.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And the whole idea of pursuing profit, it was seen by many as, well, a little bit distasteful.
Interesting. But on the other hand, merchants were essential to the economy, right?
Exactly. So they were in this tricky position.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
So how did they navigate that?
Well, they learned that there's power in numbers,
Makes sense.
especially when it comes to money.
Right. Money talks. So
Yeah.
how did that work in practice? Did they band together or something?
They did. They formed these powerful leagues, like the Hanseatic League, for example.
I've heard of them, but I don't know much about them.
Well, it was basically a trading alliance of cities, mostly in Northern Europe. And these leagues, they gave the merchants the clout they needed to negotiate favorable terms for their goods, to protect their trade routes, even to challenge the authority of kings and emperors when they had to.
Wow, that's impressive. They basically created their own little medieval trading empire.
Exactly. They understood that by banding together, they had more leverage than they could ever dream of having individually.
It's a valuable lesson there about collective bargaining, even in today's world.
Absolutely. And it's a theme that we see again and again throughout history. When powerful economic interests are at stake, well, let's just say people will go to great lengths to protect them.
Right. Greed and power, they seem to go hand in hand no matter what the time period.
Unfortunately, yeah. And the tactics, they just get more sophisticated over time.
So can we get even more specific? I mean, what did this look like, this economic warfare in the Middle Ages?
Well, take Louis the X of France, for example.
Ah.
He was a master of using what we today call embargoes, but back then were really just ways to economically isolate and weaken his political rivals.
So instead of a military siege, it was an economic siege.
Precisely. And, it wasn't just kings and emperors who were playing this game. Even the church got involved.
Oh, how so?
Well, the book talks about how the papacy back then was really invested in controlling the production of a mineral called alum.
Alum. Okay, I have to admit, that doesn't exactly sound like the most exciting commodity.
It might sound a little mundane now, but alum was essential for dyeing fabrics.
Ah, so it was a big business for the textile industry.
Huge. And controlling its production. That meant controlling a significant source of wealth and influence. And let's just say the papacy wasn't shy about throwing their weight around to maintain that control.
It really makes you think differently about those romanticized images of the Middle Ages, doesn't it?
It does.
It's less about chivalry and more about this cutthroat competition for economic dominance.
It's a side of history that doesn't always make it into the textbooks.
And it probably only intensified as we move into the age of exploration, am I right?
You are. The age of exploration, with all the excitement of discovery and adventure, was also driven by this ruthless pursuit of economic gain. European powers, eager for new sources of wealth and power, turned their attention to these new frontiers, like the Americas, the Indies, and, well, let's just say those encounters didn't always go so smoothly for the people already living there.
That's putting it mild. I mean, we're talking about violence, exploitation, a complete disregard for indigenous populations.
Exactly. And it was all driven by this thirst for gold, spices, new markets. European powers waged wars, they enslaved populations, they decimated entire civilizations.
It's a dark side of history that's so often overlooked. But it's essential to understanding the global power dynamics that we still see around us today.
100%.
It's like those innocent-looking spices in our kitchen cabinets have this whole hidden history of colonialism and exploitation behind them.
Right.
It really makes you think twice about where our stuff comes from and the real cost of economic dominance, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And it brings us to another pivotal moment in the history of economic warfare, one that really highlights how far some nations were willing to go to secure that dominance, the Opium Wars.
Ah, yes, the Opium Wars. Now, there's a story that's both fascinating and incredibly disturbing. But before we dive into the specifics of that whole chapter of history, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to unpack this complex and, frankly, appalling chapter of history. Welcome back, everyone. So, before the break, we were talking about the Opium Wars.
Right, a dark chapter for sure.
To say the least.
It's really a stark illustration of how economic interests can be used, or maybe the better word is misused, to justify force and domination on a massive scale.
So set the stage for us. What exactly happened with the Opium Wars?
Well, you gotta go back to the 19th century, the British East India Company, and this wasn't just some small-time operation.
Right, they were a major player.
Oh yeah, they had their own army, their own navy, they were a force to be reckoned with.
A company with an army. That's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is. But anyway, they were heavily involved in the tea trade with China.
Everyone loves their tea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the problem was that the British, they had this massive trade deficit with China.
Meaning they were buying way more tea than they were selling to the Chinese.
Precisely. And they needed to find a way to balance the books, right?
Of course. So that's where the opium comes in.
Bingo. The British, they saw a chance to exploit a market, tip the scales in their favor. So they started flooding China with opium, even though they knew it was addictive, that it was destroying lives.
It's amazing how often greed trumps any kind of moral conscience.
Sad but true. And of course the Chinese government, they weren't stupid. They saw what was happening. They tried to crack down on the opium trade. They knew the British were trying to weaken their nation to exploit them, really.
It's addicts, it's lost revenue, it's a way to destabilize from the inside out.
Exactly. But that played right into the hands of the British. They were just looking for an excuse to assert their dominance, and this gave them the perfect justification.
So they went to war with China over this.
Pretty much. And the British, with their superior naval power, well, they pretty much had their way.
That's putting it mildly.
They forced China to sign these humiliating treaties, the unequal treaties they were called. These treaties essentially pried open Chinese markets to British goods. They forced them to cede control of key ports, like Hong Kong. They even made British citizens in China subject to British, not Chinese law.
It's hard to imagine a clearer case of one nation exploiting another for its own economic gain. So not only did they profit from getting an entire nation hooked on opium, but they also used that as the pretext to reshape the entire political and economic landscape in their favor.
It's a really tragic chapter in history, and it highlights the dangers of what happens when you have this kind of unchecked economic ambition combined with military might.
Yeah, it's a potent reminder of how economic warfare can be a tool of imperialism. So let's shift gears a bit. The book also delves into some lesser-known but equally fascinating examples of economic warfare, like the rivalry between Venice and Genoa.
Oh yeah, the Italian city-states.
Talk about a high-stakes
Yeah.
game. They were constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
We were like those rivals in a movie, always trying to sabotage the other.
It sounds more like a soap opera set in the Renaissance.
Maybe a little bit of both. It was all about power and intrigue and, of course, economic sabotage. Don't forget that part.
So what kind of tactics are we talking about here? Give us the inside scoop.
Oh, you name it. They were masters of espionage. They'd infiltrate each other's trading posts, try to disrupt supply chains, spread nasty rumors about their competitors' goods.
Like what kind of rumors?
Oh, that a shipment of silk was infested with insects, or that a cargo of spices was actually fake. They even resorted to, shall we say, more direct methods of competition at times.
You mean like sinking each other's ships?
Oh yeah, it happened. And then they'd have these full-blown naval battles for control of important ports and trade routes.
This is better than a movie.
It's all true. And it reminds us that while we might have fancier weapons today, the drive for economic dominance, well, that's nothing new.
Not at all. So this rivalry between Venice and Genoa, were there any particularly juicy episodes that stand out?
Oh, there are plenty. But one that comes to mind involves, believe it or not, that mineral we were talking about earlier, alum,
The fabric dye.
the one and only. So Genoa, they had a corner on the market for alum production because they controlled these mines over in Phocia.
Okay.
But then you've got the Byzantine emperor. He sees an opportunity to stir up some trouble and make a little profit for himself. So he seizes these alum mines from Genoa.
Bold move.
Very bold. And of course, the Genoese, they are furious. They are not about to give up their cash cow that easily.
So what do?
Get this. They form a private company.
A company to take back the mines.
You got it. They called it the Maiona. And they used it to raise an army, launch an attack, and take back control of those precious alum mines.
Wow. Talk about taking matters into your own hands. They basically invented the corporate-funded military operation.
It's a fascinating example of how economic interests can drive the formation of these powerful entities and fuel conflict, even in the distant past.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, about some of the companies we see today. I mean, what are their true motivations? Is it just about profit? Or are there other, maybe less noble goals at play?
It's a question worth asking.
It really is. But for now, let's talk about another fascinating player in the world of economic warfare that you might not expect: the Knights Templar.
Ah, the Templars. Now, there's a group with an interesting history.
To say the least. We often think of them as these warrior monks, crusaders fighting in the Holy Land.
Which they were, of course. But their influence, it went far beyond the battlefield. They were incredibly savvy when it came to finance.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They basically established the world's first multinational banking system.
Get out of here, the Knights Templar painters. That's not exactly the image that pops into my head when I picture those knights in shining armor.
It's true. They had this vast network of what they called preceptories. Think of them like branch offices spread all across Europe and the Holy Land.
Okay.
And they offered a range of financial services, loans, money transfers, even something like safe deposit boxes. Pilgrims, for example, they could deposit their valuables at one preceptory, then withdraw them safely at another one along their journey.
Talk about convenient. They were like the Western Union of the Middle Ages.
Exactly, but all that financial acumen, well, it came with a price.
I bet. It seems like too much power, especially economic power, tends to attract unwanted attention.
You got it. The Templars, they got to be so wealthy, so influential, that they ended up on the wrong side of King Philip V of France.
Isn't he the one who was deeply in debt to the Templars?
The very same. And let's just say he wasn't too keen on having to pay back what he owed.
I can imagine. So what did he do? Just refuse to pay?
Oh, he was much more cunning than that. He came up with a plan, accused them of heresy, blasphemy, you name it.
Of course. When in doubt, blame it on religion. It seems to be a recurring theme.
Right. He had their members arrested, tortured until they confessed to these made-up crimes. Then he seized all their assets.
Talk about a hostile takeover. It's amazing how often accusations of heresy and blasphemy conveniently pop up when money is involved.
It's almost as if it's, well, a convenient excuse to grab power or wealth.
Exactly. So let's shift our focus now. We've talked about economic warfare in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, but what about more modern times? The Cold War, for example.
Yeah.
How did this battle for economic dominance play out during that era?
The Cold War is interesting because you see a shift toward more subtle tactics, things like embargoes, technology restrictions, espionage, of course.
Right, it wasn't just about military buildups and the threat of nuclear war.
Yeah.
It was this ideological struggle, too.
Exactly. And each side was trying to prove that their system, their way of life, was superior.
So how did that play out in terms of economic warfare?
Well, a great example is COCOM.
COCOM.
Yeah, it stands for the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. Right. Basically, it was this agreement between the U.S. and its allies to restrict the export of any technology that they considered strategically important to the Soviet Union and their allies.
So a kind of economic blockade to try to keep the Soviet bloc from advancing.
Exactly. They didn't want them getting their hands on anything that could give them a military advantage or even a technological edge. It was a way to try to contain their influence without resorting to, all-out war.
It was a war of ideas, a war of technology, but it was also a war for economic dominance. And I'm guessing the Soviets weren't just sitting back and letting it happen.
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, they were masters at this thing called industrial espionage.
Industrial espionage. Sounds juicy. Tell me more.
Well, they were really good at getting their hands on Western technologies,
Yeah.
Stealing secrets.
And how did they do that?
They had this whole network of spies, scientists, double agents even. These people were working within Western companies, research institutions, all feeding information back to Moscow.
It's like something out of a spy movie.
It is. And the thing is, when the Cold War ended, that didn't mean the end of this economic espionage.
Of course not. If anything, it's probably only gotten more intense.
Right. Globalization has just made the stakes even higher.
Welcome back to the show. We were just discussing how the end of the Cold War didn't exactly lead to a decrease in economic espionage. If anything, things seem to have gotten even more intense.
Oh, absolutely. Globalization, for all its benefits, has also created this incredibly complex and interconnected world where the battle for economic dominance is fiercer than ever.
And the tactics have evolved as well, right? It's not just about spies sneaking around with microfilm anymore.
Right. We're talking about cyber attacks, for one thing. I mean, can you imagine? Stealing trade secrets used to involve all this cloak and dagger stuff. You'd have to infiltrate a facility, crack safes, maybe try to photograph documents without getting caught.
Sounds risky.
It was. But today, hackers can steal mountains of data with a few keystrokes from, who knows, their mom's basement.
Right, all from the comfort of their own homes. And we're not just talking about stealing information either, are we?
Not even close. Disrupting operations, planting disinformation, even manipulating entire markets, it's all fair game in this new era of economic warfare.
So you can cripple a company, maybe even an entire industry, without a single shot being fired.
Precisely. And here's the other thing. It's not just nations playing this game anymore.
Oh, you mean like corporations spying on each other?
That's part of it. But it's bigger than that. Multinational corporations, they've got these vast resources, global reach. They're major players on the world stage now. They're using sophisticated surveillance tech, engaging in all sorts of aggressive competitive practices, even lobbying governments to, let's say, bend the rules in their favor.
It's like the whole world is a giant chessboard, with corporations and governments constantly making these strategic moves, trying to outmaneuver each other. It's a lot to keep track of.
That's why it's so important to understand this history, to recognize the patterns, the tactics.
So we're not just pawns in their game.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, after all.
I like that. So where do we go from here? Is this constant struggle for economic dominance just the inevitable future of globalization?
That's the million-dollar question. But by understanding the patterns of the past, by being aware of the tactics being used, maybe we can start pushing for a more ethical and sustainable way forward.
It's like you said, knowledge is power. The more we know about how economic forces have shaped our world, the better equipped we are to make sure those forces are used for good, not just for profit at any cost.
Well said.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've journeyed from prehistoric times where tribes clashed over hunting grounds to today's digital battlefields. And we've seen how the pursuit of economic dominance has left its mark on every era of human history. It's a fascinating and at times a rather unsettling story.
It's a story that's still being written, and as we've seen, it's not always a pretty one, but it's a story we all need to be aware of.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, we leave you with this. Keep asking questions, challenge assumptions, and never, ever underestimate the power of economic forces in shaping the world around us. Until next time, thanks for listening.